Welcome back to History for Sleep, where we drift through the deep past, one story at a time. Tonight, we're going on a slow, soothing journey into one of humanity's most transformative moments. A journey into the very first time our ancestors held a flame in their hands and understood, perhaps without words, that everything was about to change. When did we first discover fire? How did we learn to create it, control it, make it ours? And what did that single spark mean for the entire future of our species? As always, I hope this video helps you drift off gently, or at least helps you put your worries into perspective by zooming out a few 100,000 years. Of course, there's a small risk that it might be too interesting and keep you awake. But if that happens, well, at least you'll have learned something fascinating along the way. Before we float off into the past together, I'd love it if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed if you haven't already. It really helps this sleepy little channel grow. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. It's always such a joy to see our sleepy history community scattered gently across the globe. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes or stay alert. Just let the words wash over you like whispers on the wind. And as we begin this gentle voyage into the vast unknown, remember this video is for educational and relaxation purposes only, and is not intended as medical advice. Ready? Let's begin. Picture, if you will, a world without a single flame created by human hands. Not a torch, not a campfire, not even the smallest ember glowing in the darkness. This was the world of our earliest ancestors, a world that existed for millions upon millions of years before that first transformative spark. To truly understand what fire meant to humanity, we must first immerse ourselves in the profound reality of its absence. We must feel what it was like to live in a world where the only light after sunset came from the cold, distant stars and the pale face of the moon. In this ancient world, perhaps 2 million years ago, our ancestors moved through landscapes that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to us today. The African savanna stretched endlessly under a vast sky, dotted with acacia trees whose branches spread like dark veins against the horizon. But when the sun began its descent, painting the grasslands in shades of amber and gold, a transformation would begin that we, in our electrically illuminated world, can barely imagine. As that great burning orb slipped below the edge of the earth, darkness didn't just arrive. It conquered. It swept across the land like a living thing, swallowing colours, erasing distances, transforming the known world into something mysterious and dangerous. Our ancestors, these early humans who might have been Homo habilis, or perhaps early Homo erectus, understood darkness in a way we never will. They knew it with their bodies, with their racing hearts, with the way their pupils dilated, desperately trying to capture any stray photon of light. When the sun set, it wasn't just the end of the day, it was the beginning of a long, vulnerable period where they became prey rather than predator. The darkness held real, tangible dangers. The soft pad of a leopard's paw on dry grass, the low rumble of a lion's breath, the sudden snap of a twig that could mean anything or nothing, but which sent adrenaline flooding through their veins regardless. Consider for a moment how profoundly different their relationship with time must have been. Without fire, without any source of light they could control, their days were strictly bounded by the sun's journey across the sky. When darkness fell, there was nothing to do but huddle together, to find what shelter they could, and to wait. To wait through hours that must have felt like small eternities. To wait while strange sounds echoed through the darkness. To wait while the cold crept in, especially during certain seasons or in higher elevations, seeping through their skin and settling into their bones. The cold was more than discomfort. It was a constant drain on their energy, their calories, their very survival. Without fire, our ancestors had only their own bodies, and perhaps simple animal skins to ward off the chill. On cold nights, they would have pressed together, sharing what warmth they could generate, their breath misting in the air. Mothers would have held their children close, feeling their small bodies shiver, knowing that the young and the old were always the most vulnerable when temperatures dropped. The night was a test of endurance that had to be passed again and again, every single day of their lives. But perhaps even more profound than the physical challenges was the psychological weight of living without fire. Darkness, for a species that relied so heavily on vision, was a kind of blindness, and in that blindness, the imagination could run wild. Every shadow could hide a predator, every sound could signal danger. The human brain, even in its earlier forms, was remarkably good at pattern recognition, perhaps too good. In the absolute darkness of a moonless night, patterns would emerge from nothing, shapes would form and dissolve, threats would materialize from the marriage of fear and imagination. This wasn't just inconvenience or discomfort. This was the fundamental rhythm of existence. Life was divided into two distinct realms. The realm of day, where our ancestors could see, could forage, could hunt, could travel, could communicate with subtle facial expressions and gestures, and the realm of night, where they were reduced to sound and touch and smell, where they were vulnerable, where they could only wait and hope that dawn would find them whole and safe. Think about what this meant for the development of human society, human culture, human consciousness itself. Without fire, there were no evening gatherings where stories could be shared and bonds could be strengthened. There were no late-night conversations where ideas could be exchanged and plans could be made. The darkness imposed a kind of solitary confinement, even when surrounded by others. Yes, they could whisper in the dark, but without the ability to see faces, to read expressions, to share in the full spectrum of human communication, these interactions were limited, constrained, incomplete. The food they ate was another profound limitation of this fireless world. Everything was consumed raw. Tough roots that had to be chewed for long minutes to break down their fibres, meat that was stringy and difficult to digest, fruits and nuts in their natural state. The amount of time our ancestors had to spend simply chewing their food was extraordinary. Their jaw muscles were massive, their teeth worn down from the constant grinding. A significant portion of each day was devoted just to the mechanical process of breaking down food enough to swallow it. And even then, their bodies could only extract a fraction of the calories and nutrients that cooking would later make available. Disease and parasites were constant companions in this raw world. Without the purifying power of fire, every piece of meat carried the risk of harmful bacteria. Every drink of water from a stagnant pool could harbour invisible threats. Our ancestors' bodies were battlegrounds where their immune systems waged constant war against invaders. Many died young from infections and illnesses that fire would later help prevent. The survivors were those whose bodies could withstand this constant assault, but even they paid a price in energy and vitality. The landscape itself was different without human fire. Yes, natural fires occurred. Lightning strikes would occasionally set the grasslands ablaze, volcanoes would spew lava and ash. But these were rare, uncontrolled events. The regular, intentional use of fire to shape the landscape, to clear land, to regenerate growth. All of this was still far in the future. The world our ancestors inhabited was wilder, denser, less shaped by human intention. They were just one species among many, without the transformative tool that would eventually set them apart. And yet, even in this fireless world, the seeds of change were already present. Our ancestors' brains were growing slowly but steadily, generation by generation. They were making stone tools, simple but effective. They were developing more complex social structures, more sophisticated ways of communicating. They were observing the world around them with increasing curiosity and intelligence. And perhaps most importantly, they were watching fire when it occurred naturally, studying it, learning from it, filing away information that would one day prove invaluable. Because fire, even before humans could control it, was not entirely absent from their world. Lightning strikes would create wildfires that could burn for days or weeks. Volcanic activity would produce rivers of lava and fields of hot ash. Our ancestors would have witnessed these displays of natural fire with a mixture of fear and fascination. They would have seen how animals fled before the flames, how the landscape was transformed in fire's wake. They might have noticed how certain plants seemed to thrive after a fire had passed through, how new growth emerged from the blackened earth. Some researchers believe that our ancestors might have been fire followers, long before they were fire makers. After a natural fire had passed through an area, they might have ventured into the still warm ground, finding animals that had been killed by the flames, eggs that had been cooked in their shells, roots and tubers that had been roasted in the ground. These experiences would have taught them that fire, despite its danger, could also bring benefits. The taste of cooked meat, encountered by accident, might have lingered in their memory. The warmth of ground that had been heated by fire might have provided comfort on a cold night. But there's a vast gulf between opportunistically benefiting from natural fire and actually controlling it. That leap from fire as a rare, dangerous, uncontrolled force of nature to fire as a tool, a companion, a servant, that leap required something extraordinary. It required the ability to overcome one of the most basic instincts that every animal possesses, the instinct to flee from fire. It required the cognitive capacity to understand cause and effect, to plan, to imagine a future different from the present. It required courage of a kind that's difficult for us to fully appreciate. Imagine the first individual who, instead of running from a burning branch, picked it up. Feel the heat on their face, the smoke stinging their eyes, the very real danger of being burned. This wasn't just a physical act. It was a psychological revolution. It was the moment when humans began to separate themselves from every other species on Earth. No other animal, no matter how intelligent, deliberately picks up fire and carries it. Even our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, who use tools and have complex social structures, flee from fire just as every other animal does. This first act of picking up fire might have been accidental. Perhaps a burning branch fell near someone, and in trying to move it away they discovered they could carry it. Or perhaps it was deliberate, driven by curiosity or necessity. We'll never know the exact moment, the specific individual, the precise circumstances, but we do know that it happened, and that it happened multiple times, in multiple places, as this revolutionary behaviour spread through human populations. The knowledge of how to maintain fire, once obtained from nature, would have been precious beyond measure. Imagine a group that had managed to keep a fire burning, perhaps started by lightning, for days or weeks. This fire would have been guarded constantly, fed carefully with dry grass and twigs and branches. Someone would have had to stay awake through the night to tend it, to ensure it neither died out nor grew out of control. The responsibility of the firekeeper would have been immense. If the fire died, the group would have to wait for another natural fire which might not come for months or years. This is why some anthropologists believe that the ability to maintain fire preceded the ability to create it by hundreds of thousands of years. It's one thing to keep an existing flame alive. It's quite another to conjure fire from nothing but stone and wood and human will. The first skill could be learned through observation and trial and error. The second required a deep understanding of the principles of friction, heat, and combustion, even if that understanding was intuitive rather than scientific. During this long period when humans could maintain but not create fire, flames would have been treated as precious resources. Groups that possessed fire would have had enormous advantages over those that didn't. They could stay warm on cold nights. They could have light after dark. They could begin to experiment with cooking food. They could use fire to harden wooden spears, making them more effective weapons. Fire would have become a source of power, of status, perhaps even of conflict. Groups might have raided each other not for food or territory, but for fire itself. The social dynamics around fire would have been complex and fascinating. Who decided when and where to build the fire? Who was responsible for maintaining it? How was the warmth and light distributed among group members? These questions might seem trivial to us, but they would have been matters of life and death to our ancestors. Fire would have created new forms of social hierarchy, new responsibilities, new ways of organizing group life. And slowly, very slowly, fire would have begun to change not just how our ancestors lived, but who they were. The groups that were better at maintaining fire would have survived in greater numbers. The individuals who were skilled at firekeeping would have been valued, perhaps preferred as mates. Natural selection would have begun to favour traits that were advantageous in a world with fire, less body hair that could catch fire, better manual dexterity for handling burning materials, perhaps even changes in our digestive systems to better process cooked food. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before any of these changes could occur, before fire could begin its transformation of humanity, there had to be that first moment, that first spark, that first flame that was deliberately cultivated by human hands. And to understand that moment, we need to look at the evidence, the whispers from the past that tell us when and where and how humans first began their relationship with fire. The search for the origins of human fire use is one of the most challenging and contentious areas of archaeological research. Fire, unlike stone tools or bones, doesn't preserve well in the archaeological record. A campfire from 1 million years ago leaves only the faintest traces, perhaps a circle of discoloured soil, some charred bone fragments, stones that show signs of having been heated. These traces can be difficult to distinguish from the results of natural fires. A lightning strike can create charred bones and heated stones just as easily as a human-controlled fire can. This is why every claim of early fire use is scrutinised intensely by the scientific community. When archaeologists announce that they've found evidence of human-controlled fire from a particular time period, other scientists immediately begin looking for alternative explanations. Could the charred materials have been created by a natural fire? Could they have been washed into the site from elsewhere? Are the dates accurate? The debate can go on for years or decades, with evidence being reviewed, reanalyzed, reinterpreted. Despite these challenges, a picture has slowly emerged from the archaeological record, a timeline of humanity's relationship with fire that stretches back much further than we once imagined. The story this evidence tells is not one of a single invention, a eureka moment when fire was discovered. Instead, it's a story of gradual development, of fits and starts, of knowledge gained and lost and gained again. It's a story written in ash and charcoal, in heated stones and burned bones, in the microscopic remains of ancient hearths. One of the earliest potential evidence of human fire use comes from Wonderfurt Cave in South Africa. Deep inside this cave, in layers dated to about 1 million years ago, scientists have found what appears to be ash and charred bone fragments. What makes this evidence particularly compelling is its location, deep inside a cave where a natural fire would be extremely unlikely to occur. The ash contains microscopic plant remains that appear to have been burned at relatively low temperatures, consistent with a controlled fire rather than a wildfire. If this evidence is correct, it suggests that our ancestors, probably Homo erectus, were using fire in South Africa 1 million years ago. But Wonderwort Cave is not without controversy. Some scientists argue that the evidence could have been created by other processes, that the dates might be incorrect, that we need more data before we can be certain. This is the nature of archaeological research into human origins. Every discovery is debated, every interpretation challenged. It's through this rigorous process that we slowly approach the truth, even if we can never be entirely certain of it. Moving forward in time, the evidence becomes stronger and more widespread. At Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dated to around 790,000 years ago, archaeologists have found clusters of burned flint tools and wood, arranged in what appear to be hearth-like formations. The variety of wood types found suggests that someone was deliberately selecting fuel for their fires choosing different woods for different purposes perhaps. This isn't just evidence of fire use, it's evidence of sophisticated fire management. In China, as Zhoukoudian near Beijing, there's evidence of fire use dating back 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. Here, in what was once a large cave system, archaeologists have found layers of ash up to 6 meters thick in some places. This represents not just occasional fire use, but consistent, repeated use over thousands of years. The cave would have been home to Homo erectus, and later to early Homo sapiens. Generation after generation would have maintained fires in this cave, the smoke blackening the ceiling, the heat warming the stone walls. But when did humans transition from maintaining naturally occurring fire to creating it themselves? This is perhaps the most difficult question to answer from the archaeological record. The act of creating fire leaves no distinctive traces that differ from simply maintaining it. A fire started by friction looks the same as a fire started from a lightning-struck branch once it's burning. We can only infer the ability to create fire from indirect evidence. One line of reasoning suggests that the widespread use of fire by around 400,000 years ago implies the ability to create it. It seems unlikely that humans could have spread across diverse environments, from tropical Africa to temperate Europe to cold northern regions, while relying solely on naturally occurring fire. The ability to create fire on demand would have been essential for this expansion. But this is inference, not proof. The oldest direct evidence of fire-making technology is much more recent. Fire-making tools, striker lights made from flint and pyrite, or wooden fire drills, don't appear in the archaeological record until much later, perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Wooden fire-making tools would rarely preserve, and stone tools used for making fire might not look different from other stone tools. There's also the tantalizing possibility that different human populations discovered fire independently at different times. Fire use might have been discovered, lost, and rediscovered multiple times in human prehistory. A group might have maintained fire for generations, only to lose it through accident or disaster, forcing them to wait for another natural fire or to reinvent the techniques of fire creation. This pattern of discovery and loss might have repeated itself many times across the vast spans of prehistoric time. The techniques our ancestors used to create fire were likely varied and ingenious. The friction method, rubbing wood against wood until the heat of friction creates an ember, is perhaps the most ancient. This requires not just the right technique, but the right materials, woods that are dry enough, of the right hardness, with the right properties to create ember rather than just wearing away. It requires patience, skill, and strength. Creating fire by friction can take many minutes of sustained effort, even for someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The percussion method, striking stones together to create sparks, requires finding the right kinds of stone. Not all rocks will produce sparks when struck. Flint and iron pyrite work well, but these materials aren't found everywhere. Our ancestors would have had to learn through trial and error which stones in their environment could produce sparks, and then how to strike them in just the right way to direct those sparks onto tinder that would catch and hold an ember. Both methods require not just the physical technique, but a whole suite of supporting knowledge. What makes good tinder? How dry does it need to be? How do you prepare it to catch a spark or ember most easily? What woods burn hot? Which burn long? Which produce the least smoke? How do you build a fire structure that will catch from a small ember and grow into a sustainable flame? This knowledge, accumulated over generations, would have been as valuable as the techniques themselves. The social and cultural dimensions of fire creation would have been profound. In many traditional societies that anthropologists have studied, fire-making is surrounded by ritual and meaning. The person who can create fire might be seen as having special power or connection to spiritual forces. The act of creating fire might be accompanied by specific words, gestures, or ceremonies. While we can't know what beliefs our ancient ancestors held about fire, it seems likely that something so powerful, so transformative, so seemingly magical, would have been wrapped in layers of cultural meaning. Consider the first time a child watched an adult create fire from nothing but wood and effort. The concentration on the adult's face, the rhythmic motion, the gradual appearance of smoke, the sudden birth of flame. It would have seemed like magic, like the human was stealing something from the gods or from nature itself. That child would grow up in a world where humans could create light and warmth at will, a world fundamentally different from that of their ancestors, who could only wait for lightning to provide what they needed. The knowledge of fire-making would have been taught carefully, passed down from generation to generation. It was too important to be left to chance. Children would have watched adults, practiced with guidance, gradually developed their skills. The techniques would have been refined over time, each generation perhaps adding small improvements. This transmission of knowledge, this cultural evolution, was as important as the biological evolution that gave our ancestors the cognitive capacity to discover and use fire in the first place. Different groups might have developed different techniques, different traditions around fire. These differences could have become markers of group identity. We are the people who make fire this way, with these materials, with these rituals. Fire-making could have been a source of pride, of cultural cohesion, of distinction from other groups. It might have been one of the first technologies that created cultural boundaries between human populations. The spread of fire-making knowledge would have been a complex process. Did it spread from a single origin point, carried by migrating populations? Or was it discovered independently multiple times? The archaeological record doesn't give us a clear answer. What we do know is that by the time of the last ice age, all human populations had fire. It had become as essential to human life as food and water. But let's return to that moment of discovery, that first successful creation of fire by human hands. We can imagine it happening in many different ways. Perhaps it was accidental, someone napping flint tools near dry tinder, a spark flying and catching, the sudden realization that this could be repeated. Perhaps it was deliberate. Someone who had observed how heat was created by friction when shaping wooden tools, who wondered if enough friction could create fire itself. Perhaps it was inspired by observation of nature, seeing how bamboo rubbed together in the wind could create heat and smoke, and trying to replicate this phenomenon. However it happened, that first successful creation of fire must have been a moment of profound triumph, and perhaps terror. To create fire was to wield a power that had previously belonged only to nature. It was to cross a boundary that no other animal had ever crossed. The person who first created fire might have been celebrated as a hero, or feared as someone who had stolen power from the gods. They might have been expected to teach others immediately, or the knowledge might have been guarded as a precious secret. The psychological impact of being able to create fire cannot be overstated. It fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with the world. No longer were we entirely subject to the cycles of day and night, warmth and cold, cooked and raw. We had gained a measure of control over our environment that no other species possessed. This control would have changed how our ancestors saw themselves, their place in the world, their potential for shaping their own destiny. Fire creation also would have changed the dynamics of risk and exploration. A group that could create fire could venture into colder regions, knowing they could warm themselves. They could explore caves, knowing they could create light. They could travel further from known sources of natural fire, expanding their territories and resources. The ability to create fire was a key that unlocked vast new possibilities for human expansion and adaptation. The cognitive demands of fire creation and management would have driven further brain development, planning ahead to gather the right materials, maintaining focus during the lengthy process of friction firemaking, understanding the chain of causation from friction to heat to ember to flame. All of these required and reinforced complex thinking. Fire use might have created a feedback loop where more sophisticated fire management required greater intelligence, which in turn allowed for even more sophisticated use of fire. We should also consider the failures, the countless times that early humans tried and failed to create fire. Each failure would have been a learning experience, but also a potential disaster. A group that had let their carried fire die out, banking on their ability to recreate it, might have found themselves cold and vulnerable when their fire-making attempts failed. These failures would have reinforced the importance of maintaining existing fires, of having multiple people who knew the techniques, of keeping the necessary materials always at hand. The materials themselves would have become precious. A good fire drill, worn smooth through use, perfectly shaped and balanced, would have been a treasured possession. The right kinds of tinder, carefully dried and preserved, would have been gathered and guarded. Stones that could produce good sparks would have been collected and carried, perhaps traded between groups. These materials weren't just tools, they were insurance against the cold and the dark. As fire-making techniques spread and diversified, they would have adapted to different environments. In wet tropical forests, different techniques would be needed than in dry savannas. In cold northern regions, where everything might be damp or frozen, special strategies would have to be developed. This environmental adaptation of fire-making techniques represents one of humanity's first examples of technological adaptation to local conditions, a pattern that would define our species' incredible ability to inhabit every environment on Earth. The reliability of fire creation would have improved over time. What might have been an uncertain process, failing as often as succeeding, would have become more consistent as techniques improved and knowledge accumulated. This reliability would have been crucial for the demographic expansion of human populations. Groups that could reliably create fire could support larger numbers of individuals, could survive in harsher conditions, could recover from disasters that might have eliminated groups without this ability. We must also consider the gender dynamics of early fire creation and management. In many traditional societies, fire management is gendered, with specific roles and responsibilities for men and women. While we can't know for certain how early humans organised these responsibilities, it's likely that fire created new forms of division of labour. Who gathered the firewood? Who maintained the fire through the night? Who was taught the secrets of fire creation? These decisions would have shaped the social structure of early human groups. The stories and myths that grew up around fire would have been among humanity's first attempts to explain the world through narrative. Every culture we know of has myths about how humans obtained fire, usually stolen from the gods or given as a gift with conditions attached. These myths might echo ancient memories of that first acquisition of fire, transformed through countless retellings into stories of divine theft and punishment, of sacrifice and reward. Consider Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, and was punished with eternal torment, or the various Native American stories of animals bringing fire to humans. Crow, coyote, rabbit, each culture with its own variation. These stories speak to the profound importance of fire in human consciousness, and perhaps to some deep cultural memory of a time before fire, when we were at the mercy of the elements like every other animal. The transformation from a species that feared fire to one that controlled it represents one of the most fundamental changes in the history of life on Earth. It's a change that began slowly, perhaps with simply maintaining natural fires, but accelerated as our ancestors learned to create and control flame. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a process that took hundreds of thousands of years, with many failures and setbacks along the way. But once it was complete, once humans had reliable access to fire, everything changed. The cold was no longer an absolute barrier. The night was no longer a time of helplessness. Food could be transformed, made safer and more nutritious. Tools could be improved, weapons made more effective. And perhaps most importantly, humans had a gathering point, a centre around which social life could organise itself. The hearth became the heart of human society. This transformation is still ongoing in some ways. Even today, there are a few human groups who maintain traditional fire-making techniques, keeping alive skills that stretch back to the dawn of our species. Watching a skilled practitioner create fire using only friction or percussion is to witness a direct connection to our most ancient ancestors, a thread of knowledge that has been passed down through thousands of generations, as we lie here in the comfort of our modern homes, surrounded by electric lights and central heating. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate the profound journey from that first controlled flame to where we are now. Every light switch we flip, every stove we turn on, every engine that burns fuel. All of these are descendants of that first fire, that first moment when our ancestors chose to reach toward the flame rather than flee from it. The world before fire was a world of limitations, of boundaries that seemed absolute. The discovery and control of fire broke through those boundaries, opening up possibilities that our ancestors could never have imagined. It was the first great human revolution, the foundation upon which all other technological advances would build. Without fire, there would be no metalworking, no ceramics, no steam engines, no rockets to the moon. That first spark was the beginning of everything. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine that ancient world without fire one more time. Feel the absolute darkness of a moonless night. Feel the cold creeping into your bones. Feel the vulnerability, the limitation, the narrow boundaries of life without flame, and then imagine that first spark, that first tiny flame created by human hands. See how it grows, spreading light and warmth, pushing back the darkness, creating a circle of safety and possibility. That flame is still burning today, in every human heart, in every human creation. We are the children of fire, the species that chose to embrace the flame rather than fear it. The evidence for this transformation is written in the earth itself, in layers of ash and charcoal that mark the places where our ancestors gathered around their fires. Each excavated hearth is a window into the past, a moment frozen in time when humans sat around a fire just as we do today, finding comfort in its warmth and light. These archaeological sites are sacred in their way, marking the places where humanity began its journey towards civilization. At Kesem Cave in Israel, dated to around 400,000 years ago, archaeologists have found a hearth that was used repeatedly for thousands of years. The same spot, chosen perhaps for its natural ventilation or its protection from the elements, saw generation after generation of humans gathering around fire, the layers of ash built up over millennia, creating a record of continuous human presence and fire use. Standing in that cave today, you can almost feel the presence of those ancient people, see the shadows dancing on the walls as they did hundreds of thousands of years ago. The microscopic analysis of these ancient hearths reveals details that bring the past to life in unexpected ways. Scientists can identify the types of wood that were burned, telling us what trees grew in the area and what choices our ancestors made in selecting fuel. They can determine the temperatures the fires reached, giving us insights into how skilled these early humans were at fire management. They can even identify tiny fragments of cooked plants and animals, showing us what was being prepared at these ancient hearths. At some sites, the arrangement of stones around hearths suggests that our ancestors were already sophisticated in their fire management. They built windscreens to protect their flames, created different areas for different types of fires, perhaps a hot fire for cooking meat, a slower fire for warmth through the night. This wasn't random or haphazard use of fire. It was thoughtful, planned, optimized through experience and transmitted through teaching. The bones found at these sites tell their own story. Before fire, the bones found at human sites show marks from stone tools where meat was cut away, but the bones themselves are often intact. After fire becomes common, we find bones that have been broken open, their marrow extracted after being roasted to make it more accessible. We find bones that have been burned at different temperatures, suggesting different cooking methods. The very chemistry of the bones changes, carrying the signature of having been exposed to fire. But perhaps the most profound evidence comes not from what we find, but from how human fossils themselves change over time. As fire use became common, our ancestors' teeth became smaller, their jaw muscles reduced. They no longer needed the massive grinding apparatus required to process raw, tough foods. Their guts likely shortened too, though soft tissue doesn't preserve in the fossil record. These changes freed up energy that could be redirected to growing larger brains. Fire didn't just change how our ancestors lived, it changed who they were, written into their very bones. The spread of fire use across the globe can be tracked through the archaeological record, like following a trail of embers across time and space. From Africa, where the earliest evidence is found, fire use spread into the Middle East, into Europe, into Asia. Each migration into new territories was likely facilitated by fire, allowing humans to survive in climates and environments that would have been impossible without it. The hearths found at sites across the world are like signal fires, marking humanity's expansion across the planet. In Europe, sites like Terra Amata in France, dated to around 380,000 years ago, show evidence of constructed hearths, deliberate arrangements of stones to contain and control fire. This suggests that by this time, fire wasn't just being used, but architecture was being developed around it. The hearth was becoming a constructed feature, a piece of technology that could be built and rebuilt, improved and optimized. The evidence from Schöningen in Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, is particularly fascinating. Here, along with evidence of fire use, archaeologists have found wooden spears that show signs of having been hardened in fire. This is one of the earliest examples of using fire not just for warmth and cooking, but for technology. Using fire to improve other tools. The spears are perfectly balanced, aerodynamically shaped, clearly the product of skilled craftsmanship enhanced by fire. In Asia, the evidence from Dragonbone Hill at Jokudian tells a story of long-term, intensive fire use. The thick ash layer suggests that fire was maintained almost continuously for thousands of years. This wasn't occasional fire use. This was fire as a constant presence, as essential to daily life as water or shelter. The cave would have been filled with smoke much of the time, the walls blackened with soot, the air thick with the smell of burning wood and cooking food. But the archaeological record also shows us something else. The absence of fire in some places where we might expect it. There are sites with clear evidence of human habitation, but no signs of fire use, even from periods when fire was being used elsewhere. This suggests that fire knowledge wasn't universal, that some groups might have lost the ability to make or maintain fire, or never acquired it in the first place. These fireless groups would have been at a tremendous disadvantage, perhaps explaining why they eventually disappeared from the archaeological record. The seasonal patterns of fire use also tell us about how our ancestors lived. At some sites, the amount of ash and charcoal varies with the archaeological layers in ways that suggest seasonal occupation. Groups might have used certain caves intensively in winter, maintaining large fires for warmth, then moved to other locations in summer where fire was less critical. Fire allowed for this kind of seasonal flexibility, enabling humans to exploit resources across different environments throughout the year. The types of fuel used also varied seasonally and geographically. In some areas, our ancestors burned primarily wood. In others, they used animal dung, which burned slowly and steadily, perfect for maintaining warmth through a long night. In coastal areas, they might have burned dried seaweed or driftwood. This adaptability in fuel use shows a sophisticated understanding of fire and its management, a willingness to experiment and innovate based on available resources. We can also see evidence of fire being used for purposes beyond the purely practical. At some sites, certain hearths seem to have been special, perhaps ceremonial. They're larger than necessary for cooking or warmth, positioned in central locations, surrounded by artifacts that suggest gathering and ritual. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was becoming a focus for social and perhaps spiritual activities. The control of fire also led to new forms of environmental modification. There's evidence that our ancestors began using fire to modify landscapes, burning grasslands to encourage new growth that would attract game animals. This kind of landscape management through fire represents one of the first ways humans began to actively shape their environment rather than simply adapting to it. It's the beginning of the long journey toward agriculture and the complete transformation of Earth's landscapes. As we examine all this evidence, a picture emerges not of a single moment of discovery, but of a long, complex relationship between humans and fire that developed over hundreds of thousands of years. It was a relationship that began perhaps with fear and avoidance, progressed through cautious exploitation of natural fires, developed into the ability to maintain and finally create fire, and ultimately became the complete integration of fire into every aspect of human life. This relationship was not without its dangers and setbacks. Archaeological sites sometimes show evidence of fires that got out of control, burning structures, destroying resources. Our ancestors had to learn not just how to create fire, but how to control it, contain it, extinguish it when necessary. They had to develop social rules around fire use, who could build fires where, how to manage fire in shared spaces, how to prevent accidents that could be catastrophic for a small group. The smoke from these early fires would have been a constant presence in the lives of our ancestors. It would have irritated their eyes and lungs, but it also would have had benefits, keeping insects at bay, preserving meat and hides, perhaps even having medicinal properties as certain woods and plants were burned. The smell of smoke would have become the smell of home, of safety, of human presence. Even today, the smell of wood smoke can trigger deep emotional responses, perhaps echoing those ancient associations. As fire use became more sophisticated, it would have required new forms of planning and cooperation. Gathering enough fuel for a night's fire or for a winter's fires required foresight and effort. Groups would have had to organise wood-gathering expeditions, perhaps designating certain individuals for this task. The elderly or injured, who might have had difficulty contributing to hunting or other physically demanding tasks, could still contribute by tending the fire, becoming valuable members of the group rather than burdens. This brings us to one of the most profound changes that fire brought about, the creation of distinct roles within human society that went beyond simple age and sex divisions. The firekeeper, the wood gatherer, the one who knew the best places to find good tinder or the right stones for making sparks. These became specialised roles that added complexity to human social structures. Fire didn't just change how we lived, it changed how we organised ourselves as social beings. The knowledge associated with fire, where to find materials, how to prepare them, how to build different kinds of fires for different purposes, how to read the signs of weather that would affect fire making. All of this became a body of cultural knowledge that had to be preserved and transmitted. This was perhaps the beginning of what we might call education, the deliberate teaching of essential skills from one generation to the next. Fire required not just biological evolution, but cultural evolution, the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations. As you continue to drift towards sleep, feeling the warmth of your modern home, think about the unbroken chain of fires that connects you to those first flame keepers. Every fire that has ever burned has required someone to tend it, to feed it, to ensure it neither dies nor grows out of control. The knowledge of fire has been passed down through thousands of generations, each one adding their own innovations and insights, building the vast body of knowledge that we inherit today. The first spark was just the beginning. What came next? The slow transformation of human society around the hearth, the biological changes that fire made possible, the technologies that fire enabled. All of this was still to come. Our ancestors, sitting around their first controlled fires, could not have imagined where this journey would lead. They could not have known that they were taking the first steps on a path that would lead to metalworking and glass making, to steam engines and rockets, to a world transformed by the descendants of that first flame. But all of that was still far in the future. For now, in this moment we're imagining, there was just the fire itself, warm, bright, dangerous, beautiful. There was the circle of light it created in the vast darkness. There was the sense of possibility, of control, of a future that could be different from the past. That first fire was a promise, a doorway, a beginning. And as you drift off to sleep, let your mind rest in that moment of beginning, that first spark that would eventually illuminate the world. Part 2. The world remade by flame. The transformation that fire brought to humanity didn't happen in a single moment of discovery, nor did it unfold rapidly across a few generations. Instead, it was a slow, profound metamorphosis that touched every aspect of human existence, reshaping not just how our ancestors lived, but fundamentally altering who they were as a species. The flame that had been captured, tamed, and finally created by human hands became the architect of a new kind of life, one centered around a revolutionary concept that had never before existed in the natural world, the concept of home. Before fire, shelter was purely defensive, a place to hide from predators, to escape the worst of the weather, to huddle together for warmth that came only from other bodies. Caves, rock overhangs, perhaps crude constructions of branches and leaves. These were refuges, temporary stopping places in lives that were constantly in motion, following the herds, the seasons, the availability of water and food. But fire changed the very meaning of shelter. With fire, a cave became more than just a hiding place. It became a place of warmth and light, of cooking and craft, of gathering and storytelling. It became, for the first time in the history of life on Earth, a home. The hearth was the heart of this transformation. That simple circle of stones containing the flames wasn't just a practical arrangement to prevent fire from spreading. It was the first permanent human installation, the first piece of architecture that was about more than mere survival. The hearth defined space in a new way. It created an inside and an outside, a centre and a periphery. It organised human activity around itself, drawing people inward, creating a focal point for social life that had never existed before. Think about what this meant for the daily rhythm of life. As the sun began to set instead of the growing anxiety that darkness brought to their fireless ancestors, humans with fire had something to look forward to. The evening became a distinct time, different from but not inferior to the day. As shadows lengthened and the air grew cool, the fire would be built up, its warmth and light creating an island of comfort in the gathering darkness. People would begin to gather, drawn by an attraction that was more than just physical warmth. They were drawn by the promise of community, of shared time that the fire made possible. The physical arrangement around the hearth became humanity's first living room, though it might have been in a cave or under the open sky. There were preferred spots, close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close as to be uncomfortably hot, positioned to avoid the smoke when the wind shifted, with a good view of both the fire and the faces of others around it. These preferences, these small negotiations of space and comfort, were the beginning of domestic life. Status and relationships were expressed through positioning around the fire. The elderly might be given the warmest spots, children kept where they could be watched, leaders perhaps claiming positions where they could see and be seen by all. The fire extended the day in a way that had profound implications for human development. Those extra hours of light, even flickering and uncertain compared to daylight, were hours that could be used for activities impossible in darkness. Tools could be refined and repaired by firelight. Plans could be discussed when everyone was gathered together. Children could be taught not just through demonstration during the day, but through explanation and story in the evening. The fire created time for culture to develop, for knowledge to be transmitted, for bonds to be strengthened. But perhaps most importantly, the fire created the conditions for sustained conversation. In the darkness beyond the fire's reach, visual communication was impossible. Gestures, facial expressions, body language, all the non-verbal elements that make up so much of primate communication were invisible. But around the fire, faces were illuminated, expressions could be read, subtle communications could pass between individuals. The firelight, flickering and dynamic, may have even enhanced certain aspects of communication, making expression seem more dramatic, more memorable. This was the birthplace of storytelling as we know it. While our ancestors certainly communicated before fire, the hearth created the perfect conditions for narrative to flourish. The gathered audience, the dramatic lighting, the sense of safety that allowed for sustained attention, the extended time available after dark. All of these factors combined to create humanity's first theatre. Stories told around the fire weren't just entertainment, though they certainly served that function. They were the medium through which crucial information was transmitted, through which cultural values were reinforced, through which the collective memory of the group was maintained. The stories told around those first fires would have been different from the quick exchanges of information during daily activities. They could be longer, more complex, with time for detail and elaboration. They could build tension, create suspense, deliver emotional impact. The storyteller could use the fire itself as a prop, making shadows with their hands, using burning branches to illustrate points, letting the fire die down to embers for scary parts, and building it up for triumphant conclusions. The technology of fire and the art of storytelling evolved together, each enhancing the other. These fireside gatherings were where human culture was born and transmitted. It was where the young learned not just practical skills, but the beliefs, values, and histories of their people. It was where problems were discussed and solutions proposed. It was where alliances were formed and conflicts resolved. The fire didn't just warm bodies, it created the social heat necessary for human culture to develop and flourish. Without those evening gatherings around the hearth, human society as we know it could never have emerged. The acoustic properties of fire added another dimension to these gatherings, the crackle and pop of burning wood, the hiss of sap boiling, the soft roar of a well-built fire. These sounds became the background music of human social life. But more than that, the fire created acoustic spaces. In a cave, the fire's sound would echo and reverberate. Under the open sky, it would create a sphere of sound that defined the social space. People naturally modulated their voices to be heard over the fire, but not so loud as to disturb the atmosphere of intimacy that the fire created. Music and rhythm likely found their first human expressions around the fire. The regular breathing of the flames, the percussion possibilities of striking sticks together to break them for the fire, the natural tendency of humans to synchronize their movements and sounds. All of these would have combined around the hearth. Perhaps the first drums were simply logs being beaten to break them into manageable pieces for the fire, the rhythm becoming as important as the practical purpose. Perhaps the first songs were wordless melodies hummed to sleeping children in the fire's warmth, or chants that helped coordinate the work of gathering wood. The maintenance of the fire through the night created new social roles and responsibilities. Someone had to stay awake, or at least sleep lightly enough to wake when the fire needed tending. This might have been the origin of the night watch, a role that rotated among capable adults. The responsibility of keeping the fire alive through the dark hours would have been profound. To let the fire die might mean cold and vulnerability, but more than that, it might mean disappointing the group, failing in a fundamental duty. The firekeeper of the night held the comfort and safety of everyone in their hands. This responsibility would have created new forms of trust and interdependence. When you went to sleep by the fire, you were trusting that someone would keep it burning. When you took your turn tending the fire, others were trusting you. This mutual dependence, repeated night after night, would have strengthened the bonds within groups in ways that hadn't been possible before. The fire made humans not just social, but truly interdependent, relying on each other not just for hunting or protection, but for the maintenance of the technology that had become essential to their lives. The smoke from the fire, often seen as a mere byproduct or even a nuisance, played its own important roles. It helped preserve meat, drying it and coating it with chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth. It kept insects at bay, reducing the torment of mosquitoes and flies that could make life miserable and spread disease. It may have had medicinal properties, as different woods and plants burned for their specific effects. The smoke also marked human presence, sending signals that could be seen from great distances, allowing groups to locate each other or warning others of occupied territories. The smell of smoke became one of the defining sensory experiences of being human. It permeated everything: clothing, hair, the very caves and shelters where people lived. This smell would have become deeply associated with safety, warmth, food, and companionship. Even today, hundreds of thousands of years later, the smell of wood smoke can trigger powerful emotional responses, perhaps touching something deep in our genetic memory. We are creatures shaped by smoke as much as by fire, our ancestors having lived with that scent in their nostrils for countless generations. The light from the fire fundamentally changed how humans experienced and thought about space. In the darkness, space contracts to what can be touched or heard. But firelight expanded space, creating a visible sphere that extended beyond the reach of hands. This sphere of light was humanity's first controlled environment, a space defined not by natural features, but by human action. Within this sphere, humans were in control. Beyond it lay the unknown, the dangerous, the wild. This division between the firelit human space and the dark, wild space was perhaps the beginning of the concept of civilization versus nature, a dichotomy that would shape human thought for millennia to come. The shadows cast by firelight added another dimension to human experience. Unlike the sun, which casts shadows that move predictably through the day, fire creates shadows that dance and flicker, that seem alive. These moving shadows would have been humanity's first animation, the first moving images that could be controlled and manipulated. Shadow puppets, one of the oldest forms of entertainment, likely originated around these ancient fires. The play of light and shadow on cave walls might have inspired the first visual art, as humans attempted to capture and control these ephemeral images. Fire also changed the human relationship with materials. Many substances that are solid and unchangeable at normal temperatures become malleable when heated. Wood could be bent after heating, making it possible to create new shapes for tools and weapons. Stones that would shatter if struck when cold could be shaped more precisely after heating. Plant fibers became more pliable, easier to weave and work. The fire was humanity's first laboratory, a place where the properties of materials could be explored and manipulated. The warmth of the fire made it possible for humans to shed some of their body hair, a process that had probably begun before fire, but accelerated once reliable warmth was available. Less body hair meant fewer parasites, better cooling during physical exertion, and perhaps advantages in aquatic environments. But it also meant greater dependence on fire for warmth. Humans became the naked ape in part because they had fire to replace the fur they lost. This biological change, driven by cultural innovation, is a perfect example of gene-culture coevolution, where cultural practices drive biological evolution. The social dynamics around the hearth would have been complex and constantly evolving. Conflicts that during the day might lead to physical confrontation had to be managed differently in the close quarters around the fire. The fire enforced a kind of peace, or at least a truce. It's hard to maintain violent conflict when you're sitting together in a small circle of light, dependent on each other for warmth and protection. The fire may have been humanity's first peacekeeping force, creating conditions where negotiation and reconciliation were more likely than continued conflict. Romance and courtship would have been transformed by the fire. The soft light that concealed flaws and enhanced beauty the intimate atmosphere of the evening gathering, the opportunity for sustained interaction and conversation. All of these created new possibilities for pair bonding. The fireside became a place where potential mates could display their qualities: storytelling ability, humour, knowledge, skill at tending the fire. The dynamics of human mate choice, already complex in our primate ancestors, became even more elaborate in the firelight. Children's development was profoundly affected by the hearth. Instead of going to sleep when darkness fell, children could stay awake, listening to adults talk, absorbing language and culture. The extra hours of social interaction accelerated language, learning and cultural transmission. Children could watch adults working by firelight, learning through observation skills that would have been invisible in darkness. The fire extended childhood learning time, allowing for the transmission of more complex cultural knowledge. The fire also created new dangers that had to be managed. Burns became a common injury, especially for children who hadn't yet learned proper fire safety. Smoke inhalation could damage lungs over time. Fires could get out of control, destroying shelters and resources. These dangers required new forms of vigilance and new cultural rules. Children had to be taught not just how to use fire, but how to respect it. The duality of fire, beneficial and dangerous, creative and destructive, became one of the first complex concepts that human children had to master. The accumulation of ash and charcoal around long-term hearths created new micro-environments. The soil enriched by ash supported different plants, perhaps some that were useful for food or medicine. Humans began to notice these patterns, the first observations that would eventually lead to agriculture. The areas around ancient hearths became unintentional gardens, places where useful plants thrived because of human activity. This was the very beginning of the process by which humans would transform entire landscapes. The need for fuel created the first human supply chains. Wood had to be gathered, dried, stored. Different woods for different purposes had to be identified and collected. This required planning, cooperation, and the development of storage techniques. Dry wood had to be protected from rain. Supplies had to be built up before winter. The logistics of maintaining a reliable fuel supply were complex, requiring forms of organisation and planning that wouldn't have been necessary without fire. As groups became more dependent on fire, the loss of fire became an existential threat. Stories from various cultures speak of times when the fire was lost, through neglect, through rain, through conflict. These stories often take on mythic proportions, suggesting how traumatic such losses were. A group that lost its fire and couldn't recreate it would be thrust back into a pre-fire existence, vulnerable and cold. The pressure to maintain fire-making knowledge and skills would have been intense. The fire became a marker of human presence that could last long after the humans had gone. Charcoal and ash layers in archaeological sites tell us where humans lived, how long they stayed, what they burned. The fire left a signature on the landscape, a mark that said humans were here. This was the beginning of the human impact on the geological record, the first faint traces of what would eventually become the Anthropocene. Different groups developed different fire cultures. Some might have preferred hot, fast-burning fires for quick cooking. Others might have specialised in slow, smoky fires for preserving meat. These preferences would have been passed down through generations, becoming part of group identity. We are the people who build fires this way, who use this wood, who arrange our hearths in this pattern. Fire culture became part of what distinguished one group of humans from another. The seasonal rhythms of fire use created annual cycles of activity. In summer, fires might be small, used mainly for cooking and evening gatherings. In winter, they would be larger, maintained constantly for warmth. The preparation for winter would involve gathering and storing large quantities of fuel. The first day of spring, when the big warming fires were no longer needed, would have been a celebration, a sign that the group had survived another winter. These seasonal patterns around fire use were perhaps humanity's first calendar. marking the passage of time through the cycle of fire needs. The fire also changed human demographics. Elderly individuals who might have been unable to contribute to hunting or gathering could tend the fire, becoming valuable members of the group rather than burdens. This may have been one of the factors that allowed humans to evolve longer lifespans than our primate relatives. Grandparents who could tend fire and children, freeing younger adults for other activities, would have increased the survival chances of their grandchildren, passing on genes for longevity. Injuries and illnesses that would have been fatal without fire became survivable. A person with a broken leg could stay by the fire, keeping warm, cooking for others, maintaining their strength until they healed. The fire created a space for convalescence, for recovery. It allowed groups to care for their injured and sick in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the warmth and stability that fire provided. This care for the vulnerable is one of the defining characteristics of humanity, and it was made possible by fire. The smoke from fires may have had cognitive effects that we're only beginning to understand. Some researchers suggest that chronic exposure to wood smoke might have influenced brain development, possibly contributing to the expansion of certain brain regions. While too much smoke is certainly harmful, the low-level exposure that our ancestors experienced for hundreds of thousands of years might have had subtle effects on neurological development. We evolved in smoke-filled environments, and our brains might bear the marks of that evolution. Fire enabled the first chemical processing of materials. Heating certain stones produced pigments that could be used for decoration or symbolic marking. Certain plants, when burned, produced tars and resins that could be used as adhesives. The chemistry of combustion, though not understood scientifically, was explored empirically. Our ancestors became practical chemists, learning through trial and error which materials produced useful products when burned. The control of fire gave humans their first real power over other animals. A burning branch could drive away predators that no amount of shouting or stone throwing could deter. Fire could be used to drive game animals over cliffs or into traps. The sight and smell of fire triggered deep instinctual fear in most animals, giving humans a psychological advantage that compensated for their relative physical weakness. With fire, humans became formidable, able to stand their ground against creatures much larger and stronger than themselves. This power over animals extended to hunting techniques. Fire could be used to clear underbrush, making it easier to track game. Smoke could be used to drive animals from their hiding places. Grasslands could be burned to create new growth that would attract grazing animals. These techniques required sophisticated understanding of animal behavior and ecology, knowledge that was accumulated over generations and transmitted through the stories told around the fire. The fire also attracted certain animals. Some birds learned to follow smoke, knowing it might mean insects fleeing from the flames. Some scavengers learned that human fires meant the possibility of cooked food scraps. This began the long process of animals adapting to human presence, eventually leading to domestication. The first proto-dogs might have been wolves attracted to the warmth and food scraps around human fires, beginning a partnership that continues to this day. Fire changed the microbial environment around humans. The heat killed many harmful bacteria and parasites. The smoke had antimicrobial properties. The ash created alkaline conditions that inhibited certain pathogens. While our ancestors didn't understand germ theory, they would have noticed that people who stayed near the fire stayed healthier. The hearth became a zone of relative hygiene in a world full of infectious diseases. The cooking of food was perhaps the most transformative aspect of fire use, but it didn't happen all at once. At first, cooking might have been accidental. Food dropped in the fire or found already cooked after a wildfire. Then came intentional but simple cooking, meat held over flames on sticks. Eventually, more sophisticated techniques developed. Food wrapped in leaves and placed in coals, stones heated in the fire and dropped into water to boil it, clay vessels that could withstand heat. Each innovation in cooking technique unlocked new nutritional possibilities. Cooking did more than just make food safer and more digestible. It changed the flavor profiles available to humans, creating new sensory experiences. The Maillard reaction, the chemical process that creates the complex flavors in roasted meat, would have been a revelation to tongues accustomed to raw food. The caramelization of plant sugars when exposed to heat created sweetness where none had existed before. Cooking made eating not just about nutrition, but about pleasure, about the aesthetic experience of food. The time saved by cooking was enormous. Raw meat requires extensive chewing, sometimes hours per day. Cooked meat can be consumed much more quickly. This freed up time for other activities, tool-making, social interaction, exploration. It also reduced the caloric cost of digestion. Cooked food requires less energy to process, leaving more energy available for other biological functions, particularly brain development and maintenance. The large brains that characterize our species would not have been possible without the extra calories that cooking made available. The social aspects of cooking were as important as the nutritional ones. Cooking created new forms of sharing and reciprocity. Someone had to tend the fire while food cooked. Food had to be distributed among group members. Recipes and techniques had to be taught and learned. Cooking became a social activity that brought people together, reinforced bonds, and created opportunities for cooperation and conflict resolution. The shared meal around the fire became a fundamental human institution. Different cooking techniques produced different results, and preferences for these differences might have been among humanity's first aesthetic choices. Some might have preferred meat charred on the outside, others might have liked it slow-cooked until it fell apart. These preferences, transmitted culturally, became part of group identity and individual personality. The development of cuisine, one of the defining features of human culture, began around those first cooking fires. The preservation of food through smoking and drying, made possible by fire, changed human mobility and survival strategies. Groups could prepare food in times of abundance and save it for lean times. They could carry preserved food on long journeys. This reduced the constant pressure to find food every day, allowing for longer-term planning and more complex activities. The ability to store food was a crucial step toward the eventual development of agriculture and settled life. Fire also made new foods edible. Many plants that are toxic or indigestible when raw become nutritious when cooked. Roots and tubers that would have been impossible to chew and digest raw became staple foods when roasted. This greatly expanded the range of foods available to humans, allowing them to exploit new ecological niches. Areas that might have had insufficient raw foods to support human groups became habitable once cooking made previously inedible plants usable. The detoxification of plants through cooking was particularly important. Many plants produce chemical defenses against being eaten, compounds that are bitter, toxic, or indigestible. Heat breaks down many of these compounds, making the plants safe to eat. This allowed humans to exploit plant foods that other animals couldn't use, reducing competition and expanding the human dietary niche. The ability to eat a wider range of foods made humans more adaptable, able to survive in diverse environments. The cooking of starchy foods was particularly transformative. Raw starch is difficult for humans to digest, but cooking breaks it down into sugars that can be easily absorbed. This made high-energy foods like roots and tubers available to our ancestors, providing the calories necessary for larger brains and more active lifestyles. The consumption of cooked starches may have been one of the key factors that allowed human populations to grow and spread across the globe. The chemistry of cooking is complex, and our ancestors learned it through experimentation and observation. They discovered that certain foods needed high heat, others low heat, that some foods benefited from dry heat, others from moist heat, that the order in which ingredients were added could affect the final result. This practical knowledge, accumulated over thousands of generations, was the beginning of science. The systematic observation of cause and effect, the development of theories about how the world works. The gender dynamics of cooking varied across cultures, but in many societies, cooking became primarily associated with women. This had profound implications for social structure and gender roles. Women who were skilled cooks gained status and influence. The knowledge of recipes and techniques became a form of cultural capital that could be passed from mother to daughter. The hearth became a female domain in many cultures, a space where women exercised control and authority. But cooking was never exclusively a female activity. In many societies, certain types of cooking, especially the roasting of large game animals, was done by men. The barbecue, in its most ancient form, was perhaps a male counterpart to the female-dominated hearth cooking. These divisions of labour around food preparation created complex social dynamics that continue to influence human societies today. Children learned about food and cooking from an early age, watching adults prepare meals, helping with simple tasks, gradually taking on more responsibility. The teaching of cooking skills was one of the primary ways that cultural knowledge was transmitted across generations. Recipes were more than just instructions for preparing food. They were carriers of cultural identity, family history, and social values. The rhythm of meals structured the day in new ways. The preparation of cooked food took time, creating natural gathering points in the daily schedule. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. These became social institutions, times when the group came together not just to eat but to share information, make decisions, strengthen bonds. The meal became a fundamental unit of social time, a pattern that continues in human societies worldwide. Fire and cooking also changed human anatomy in ways that are still visible in our bodies today. Our teeth became smaller because we no longer needed massive molars to grind tough raw foods. Our jaw muscles reduced in size for the same reason. Our faces became flatter, less prognathous, because we didn't need the forward-jutting jaws of our raw food-eating ancestors. These changes in skull structure may have had secondary effects, potentially influencing brain development by changing the architecture of the skull. Our digestive systems also changed. Our guts became shorter, particularly the large intestine that in other primates is needed to ferment and break down tough plant materials. A shorter gut meant less energy devoted to digestion, more available for other organs, particularly the brain. The expensive tissue hypothesis suggests that the reduction in gut size made possible by cooking was directly related to the increase in brain size that characterizes human evolution. The control of fire for cooking gave humans a unique ecological niche. We became the cooking ape, the only species that regularly processes its food with heat before consumption. This niche was so successful that it allowed humans to spread across the globe, adapting to environments from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. Wherever humans went, they brought fire and cooking with them, transforming local ingredients into nourishment through the universal technology of controlled combustion. As cooking techniques became more sophisticated, they began to influence other technologies. The need to hold food over fire led to the development of tools, tongs, spits, grates. The desire to contain liquids while heating them drove the innovation of ceramic pottery. The observation that certain stones could withstand heat led to their use as cooking surfaces and eventually to the discovery of metals. Cooking was a driver of technological innovation, pushing humans to develop new tools and techniques. The aesthetic dimensions of cooking, the presentation of food, the combination of flavors, the social rituals around meals, became increasingly elaborate over time. Food became not just sustenance but art, a medium for creative expression. The chef, in its most ancient form, was perhaps one of humanity's first artists, creating experiences that engaged all the senses. The appreciation of well-prepared food became a marker of cultural sophistication. The fire that cooked our food also transformed our relationship with time. Cooking takes time. Time for the fire to heat up, time for the food to cook through, time for flavors to develop. This enforced patience, planning, delayed gratification. You couldn't simply grab food and eat it immediately. You had to wait, to tend, to monitor. This temporal discipline learned around the cooking fire perhaps contributed to the human ability to plan for the future, to work toward delayed rewards. The sharing of cooked food created new forms of social obligation and reciprocity. If someone shared their cooked food with you today, you were obligated to share with them tomorrow. These networks of obligation bound groups together, creating social safety nets that helped individuals survive temporary hardships. The economy of cooked food was perhaps humanity's first economy, based on reciprocity, reputation, and social debt. Fire and cooking also influenced human migration patterns. Groups could only travel as far as they could reliably make fire or carry it with them. The development of portable fire-making technologies would have been crucial for long-distance migration. The ability to cook local foods wherever they went allowed humans to adapt quickly to new environments. Each new territory offered new ingredients, new challenges, new opportunities for culinary innovation. The smoke from cooking fires carried information. Different foods produced different smells when cooked, and these smells could travel long distances. The smell of roasting meat might attract other humans, leading to social contact, trade, or conflict. It might also attract predators and scavengers, requiring vigilance and defensive measures. The olfactory landscape created by cooking fires was a new form of long-distance communication, intentional or not. The development of food taboos and preferences, many of which centered around cooked foods, became markers of cultural identity. Some groups might refuse to eat certain animals or insist on particular cooking methods. These rules, often given religious or spiritual justification, helped maintain group cohesion and identity. They were boundaries that defined us versus them, creating cultural diversity that enriched human society, while sometimes leading to conflict. As cooking became more central to human life, it began to appear in spiritual and religious contexts. Many cultures developed rituals around food preparation and consumption. Offerings to gods or ancestors often consisted of cooked foods. The transformation of raw ingredients into cooked meals became a metaphor for other transformations: spiritual, social, developmental. The alchemy of cooking became a model for understanding other processes of change and growth. The hearth, where food was cooked, became sacred space in many cultures. It was the center of the home, the source of nourishment, the gathering place for family. Hearth gods and goddesses appeared in many mythologies, protecting the fire and the food, ensuring the well-being of the household. The violation of hearth sanctity was considered particularly heinous, a crime against the very foundation of civilized life. Fire's light extended human activity into the night, creating possibilities that had never existed before. The darkness that had once ended all productive activity became merely a different environment for work and social interaction. Tasks that required good light could still be performed by firelight, though perhaps more slowly and carefully. Tool-making, weaving, food preparation, all could continue after sunset. This effectively lengthened the human day, providing more time for the activities that build culture and technology. The quality of firelight was different from sunlight in ways that influenced what could be done. Firelight is warm-toned, flickering, creating moving shadows and changing intensities. Fine detail work was challenging, but the dramatic lighting was perfect for storytelling, for creating atmosphere, for social bonding. The activities that thrived in firelight were those that benefited from or could tolerate its unique characteristics. Night became productive time rather than merely time to be endured. Stories could be told, songs could be sung, plans could be made. The extended waking hours allowed for activities that weren't directly related to immediate survival. This was when culture flourished, when myths were created and transmitted, when social bonds were strengthened, when the collective identity of the group was reinforced. The firelit evening became the time for being human rather than merely surviving. The fire's light also changed how humans thought about knowledge and mystery. In the circle of firelight, things were known, visible, understood. Beyond that circle lay darkness, mystery, the unknown. This physical reality became a powerful metaphor that shaped human thinking. Knowledge was light, ignorance was darkness, understanding was illumination, confusion was shadow. These metaphors, born from the physical experience of fire, continue to structure how we think about cognition and learning. The need to maintain fire through the night created the institution of the night watch. Someone had to stay awake, or at least sleep lightly enough to tend the fire when needed. This responsibility rotated among group members, creating a system of shared duty that strengthened social bonds. The night watcher protected not just the fire, but the entire group, watching for predators, listening for dangers. This role, born from the need to maintain fire, evolved into more complex forms of social organization around security and vigilance. The stories told in firelight were different from daytime communication. They could be longer, more elaborate, more dramatic. The audience was captive, gathered in the circle of light with nowhere else to go. The storyteller could use the fire itself as a prop, creating shadows, using burning branches for emphasis, letting the fire die down to create suspense. The technology of fire and the art of narrative evolved together, each enhancing the other. These fireside stories served multiple functions. They transmitted practical knowledge, where to find water, how to track animals, which plants were safe to eat. They reinforced social norms and values through tales of heroes and villains, right and wrong behavior. They explained the world through myths and legends, providing answers to the big questions that human consciousness inevitably raises. They entertained, creating shared emotional experiences that bonded the group together. The development of narrative thinking facilitated by firelight, storytelling, was crucial for human cognitive evolution. Stories allow us to imagine scenarios we haven't experienced, to learn from others' mistakes, to plan for contingencies. They let us travel in time, revisiting the past and imagining the future. The ability to construct and understand complex narratives, developed around ancient fires, became one of the defining characteristics of human cognition. Music and dance likely flourished in the firelight. The rhythmic crackling of the fire itself provided a beat. Clapping, stamping, and simple percussion instruments could accompany songs. The flickering light made movement seem more dramatic, more fluid. Dance around the fire became a way to celebrate, to mourn, to mark important transitions. The combination of music, movement, and firelight created altered states of consciousness, perhaps humanity's first deliberate attempts to transcend ordinary experience. The fire became a teacher in its own right. Children watching the flames learned about cause and effect. Add wood, and the fire grows. Neglect it, and it dies. They learned about transformation. Solid wood becoming gas and ash. They learned about danger and safety, about the dual nature of powerful forces. The fire was a physics lesson, a chemistry experiment, a philosophy seminar, all rolled into one immediate visceral experience. The mathematics of fire management required counting and calculation. How much wood would be needed for a night? How long would a particular log burn? How many people could be warmed by a fire of a given size? These practical questions led to numerical thinking, to the development of measurement and estimation skills. The fire was humanity's first classroom for quantitative reasoning. The fire's demand for fuel created humanity's first resource management challenge. Wood couldn't be gathered indiscriminately. Taking too much from one area would deplete it, requiring longer trips for future gathering. Deadwood was preferred, but in some seasons it was scarce. Different woods had different properties. Some burned hot and fast, others slow and steady. Managing these resources required planning, cooperation, and the development of sustainable practices. This resource management extended to the broader landscape. Areas around long-term camps would become depleted of easily gathered fuel, requiring either longer gathering trips or relocation of the camp. This might have been one of the factors driving the semi-nomadic lifestyle of many hunter-gatherer groups. The fire's appetite for fuel shaped human settlement patterns and territorial behaviour. The ash and charcoal from fires enriched the soil, creating patches of fertility that our ancestors would have noticed. Plants grew differently in areas where fires had been, often more vigorously. This observation, repeated over thousands of generations, laid the groundwork for the eventual development of agriculture. The connection between fire, ash, and plant growth was one of the first ecological relationships that humans understood and exploited. Fire also became a tool for landscape management on a larger scale. Controlled burns could clear underbrush, making travel easier and reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfires. They could encourage new growth that would attract game animals. They could open up forests, creating the mosaic of habitats that many species, including humans, prefer. This deliberate use of fire to shape landscapes was one of the first ways humans became ecosystem engineers. The smoke from fires had effects beyond the immediate vicinity. It could signal location to other groups, either intentionally or accidentally. Smoke signals became one of humanity's first long-distance communication technologies. The pattern of smoke, continuous or intermittent, thick or thin, could convey different messages. This required both sender and receiver to understand the code, representing an early form of symbolic communication. The visual impact of fire at night was profound. A fire could be seen from great distances in darkness, a beacon that could guide lost group members home or warn others of human presence. The sight of distant fires would have told our ancestors that they were not alone, that other human groups were out there in the darkness. This knowledge could be comforting or threatening depending on the relationships between groups. The fire became central to human concepts of territory and property. A hearth represented investment, the effort to build it, the knowledge of how to maintain it, the accumulated ash and charcoal that improved the soil. Abandoning a good hearth site was a loss. Claiming someone else's hearth was an aggressive act. The fire became one of the first forms of improved property, something that humans modified and therefore felt ownership over. Conflicts over fire resources, good hearth sites, fuel supplies, the fire itself in times when making new fire was difficult, would have been common. These conflicts required resolution mechanisms that went beyond simple dominance hierarchies, negotiation, trade, sharing agreements. These social innovations were driven in part by the need to manage fire-related resources peacefully. The fire was a driver of social evolution, pushing humans toward more complex forms of cooperation and conflict resolution. The spiritual and symbolic dimensions of fire developed alongside its practical uses. Fire seemed alive. It moved. It consumed. It grew and died. It transformed substances from one form to another. It provided warmth like a living body. It required care and feeding like a dependent. These qualities made fire seem animate, perhaps spiritual. Many cultures developed beliefs about fire spirits, fire gods, the sacred nature of flame. The theft of fire became a common mythological theme across cultures. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, various animal spirits bringing fire to humans. These stories reflect the profound importance of fire and perhaps a cultural memory of times before fire was common. The idea that fire was divine property that humans somehow acquired illegitimately speaks to its transformative power and the revolutionary nature of its control. Fire rituals became important markers of social transitions. New fires might be lit to mark the new year, new leadership, new alliances. Sacred fires that were never allowed to die became symbols of continuity and group identity. The Olympic flame, carried from ancient Olympia to modern Olympic Games, is a continuation of this ancient tradition of fire as a symbol of human achievement and continuity. The duality of fire, creative and destructive, helpful and harmful, controlled and wild, became a template for understanding other dualities in human experience: good and evil, love and hate, creation and destruction. These conceptual pairs might have been first understood through the direct experience of fire's dual nature. The fire became a philosophical teacher, demonstrating through immediate experience the complex, contradictory nature of powerful forces. As humans spread across the globe, they carried fire with them into new environments. Each new ecosystem presented different challenges for fire management. Wet tropical forests required different strategies than dry savannas. Cold northern regions presented the challenge of finding fuel when everything was covered in snow. Island environments might lack suitable fire-making materials. Each challenge required innovation, adaptation, the development of new techniques. The adaptations different human groups developed for managing fire in their specific environments became part of their cultural identity. Arctic peoples learned to burn animal fat when wood was unavailable. Desert peoples developed techniques for making fire with minimal fuel. Forest peoples learned which woods burned even when damp. These local innovations, transmitted culturally, allowed humans to thrive in Earth's most challenging environments. The fire became a constant companion as humans migrated across continents. Groups moving into unknown territories would have carefully maintained their fires, knowing that if they lost them in an unfamiliar landscape, they might not know how to recreate them with local materials. The fire was carried like a precious treasure, protected from rain and wind, fed constantly, never allowed to die. The migration routes of early humans were in part determined by the availability of fuel and the ability to maintain fire during travel. Sea crossings presented particular challenges for fire maintenance. How do you keep a fire burning on a raft or simple boat? The development of techniques for transporting fire across water would have been crucial for the human colonization of islands and continents separated by water. Perhaps fire was carried in smouldering logs, or as coals in shells or hollow stones. The successful transportation of fire across water barriers was a technological achievement that enabled human expansion into new worlds. The arrival of humans with fire in previously fire-naive ecosystems had profound ecological impacts. Islands that had evolved without regular fire suddenly experienced human-controlled burns. Species that had no adaptations to fire were vulnerable. Landscapes were transformed. The introduction of fire by humans was one of the first major anthropogenic impacts on global ecology, beginning a process of human-driven environmental change that continues to this day. But fire also connected human groups across vast distances. The universal human experience of sitting around a fire, of cooking food, of gathering in the circle of firelight, created commonalities that transcended cultural differences. Trade networks might have initially formed around fire-related resources: good flint for making sparks, particular woods prized for their burning qualities. The fire was both a universal human technology and a source of cultural diversity. The smoke from human fires began to leave a mark on the global atmosphere. While insignificant compared to modern industrial emissions, the carbon released from hundreds of thousands of years of human fires can be detected in ice cores and sediment layers. Humanity began its impact on global atmospheric chemistry long before the Industrial Revolution, one breath of smoke at a time, one fire at a time, accumulating over millennia. The charcoal from human fires became part of the soil carbon reservoir. Unlike wood that decomposes and releases its carbon back to the atmosphere relatively quickly, charcoal can persist in soils for thousands of years. The terra preta soils of the Amazon, enriched by centuries of indigenous fire management, remain fertile today. Human fire use began the process of modifying global carbon cycles, a process that has accelerated dramatically in recent centuries. Fire enabled the development of new technologies that would eventually transform human society. The observation that certain stones changed when heated led to the discovery of metals. The need to contain fire led to the development of ceramics. The desire to control fire more precisely led to the invention of furnaces and forges. Each innovation built on previous knowledge, creating a cascade of technological development that started with simple fire control. The metallurgy that fire made possible changed human society profoundly. Copper, bronze, iron. Each metal age brought new tools, new weapons, new possibilities, but none of it would have been possible without the high temperatures that only controlled fire could provide. The blacksmith's forge was a direct descendant of the first cooking fire, the same basic technology applied to new purposes. Ceramics, born from the observation that clay hardened when heated, revolutionized food storage and preparation. Pottery allowed for new cooking techniques, boiling, stewing, fermenting. It made it possible to store liquids and grains, supporting larger populations and more settled lifestyles. The potter's kiln was another child of the original hearth, fire's heat harnessed for transformation of materials. Glass, discovered perhaps when sand was heated in very hot fires, opened up new possibilities for containers, tools, and eventually optics. Windows that let in light while keeping out cold, lenses that extended human vision, vessels that could hold acids and other reactive substances, all made possible by fire's transformative heat. The glassblower's furnace continued the ancient tradition of using fire to reshape the world. The chemistry that fire enabled went far beyond simple heating. Combustion reactions, reduction and oxidation, pyrolysis. These chemical processes, discovered empirically through experimentation with fire, laid the groundwork for the eventual development of scientific chemistry. The alchemist's furnace, the chemist's Bunsen burner, the modern industrial reactor, all are descendants of the first controlled fire. Steam power, which launched the Industrial Revolution, was simply a new way of harnessing fire's energy. The steam engine converted the heat of combustion into mechanical work, multiplying human power 1,000-fold. The factories, railways, and steamships that transformed the world were all powered by fire, controlled and channeled through increasingly sophisticated technologies. The internal combustion engine brought fire inside machinery in a new way. Instead of external fire heating water to create steam, fire now happened inside the engine itself, tiny explosions driving pistons directly. The automobile, the airplane, the modern world of rapid transportation, all made possible by the controlled combustion that our ancestors first achieved with wood and stone. Electricity generation, which powers our modern world, still relies primarily on fire. Coal, natural gas, oil. These fossil fuels are burned to create the heat that drives turbines that generate electricity. Even nuclear power is essentially a fire that burns uranium instead of wood. The lights that illuminate our cities, the computers that process our information, the motors that drive our machines, most are powered ultimately by fire. The rocket engine represents perhaps the ultimate expression of controlled fire. Combustion so intense it can lift thousands of tons against Earth's gravity, so precise it can be throttled and directed to navigate the solar system. The fires that carried humans to the moon were direct descendants of the first cooking fire, the same basic principle of controlled combustion applied with extraordinary sophistication. But as fire technology became more powerful, its dangers grew as well. Forest fires that might have burned a few hundred acres in prehistoric times now can consume millions. Industrial fires can release toxic chemicals that poison air and water. The combustion of fossil fuels is changing the global climate. The same fire that enabled human civilization now threatens it. We are still learning to manage fire, still struggling with its dual nature, still negotiating our relationship with the flame. The psychological and cultural impact of fire continues to shape human experience. The fireplace remains a focal point in many homes, even when it's no longer needed for heat or cooking. Candles are lit for romance, for ceremony, for remembrance. Campfires still draw people together, creating the same circle of light and warmth that brought our ancestors together. The primal appeal of fire remains strong, encoded in our genes and our cultures. The metaphors of fire permeate human language and thought. We speak of burning desire, fiery tempers, inflammatory rhetoric. Ideas catch fire and spread. People burn out or burn bridges. The spark of creativity, the flame of love, the fire in the belly. These metaphors, drawn from direct experience of fire, structure how we think about emotion, motivation, and social dynamics. Fire remains central to human celebration and mourning. Birthday candles, Olympic flames, eternal flames at memorials. Fire marks our important moments. Cremation returns human bodies to ash, completing a cycle that began when our ancestors first sat around a fire. The presence or absence of fire signals significance, creating atmosphere, marking transitions. The control of fire remains a marker of human competence and self-sufficiency. The ability to start a fire without matches or lighters is still seen as a valuable survival skill. Firemaking is taught in outdoor education programs, practiced by bushcraft enthusiasts, demonstrated in survival shows. The knowledge that our ancestors developed over hundreds of thousands of years is still valued, still transmitted, still seen as essential to being human. As we look to the future, fire continues to shape human destiny. The challenge of climate change is essentially a challenge of fire. How to meet human energy needs without burning fossil fuels that release carbon dioxide. The development of renewable energy is an attempt to harness the sun's fire directly through solar panels, or indirectly through wind and hydropower. The future of human civilization depends on our ability to manage fire on a planetary scale. The possibility of carrying fire to other worlds drives space exploration. Rocket engines, controlled fusion reactors, the terraforming of Mars, all involve fire in various forms. If humans become a multiplanetary species, it will be fire that carries us to the stars, just as it was fire that allowed our ancestors to spread across Earth. The same technology that separated us from other animals might one day separate us from our home planet. But perhaps the most profound legacy of fire is not technological but social. The circle of people around a fire, sharing warmth, food and stories, established the template for human society. The hearth created the home created the family, families created communities, communities created civilizations. Every human institution, from the smallest household to the United Nations, has its roots in that first circle of firelight. The fire within us, the metabolic combustion that powers our cells, connects us to the external fires we create and control. We are beings of fire in a very literal sense. Our body is maintaining a constant temperature through internal combustion of food. The warmth we feel from a fire resonates with the warmth within us. We are drawn to fire because we are, in a sense, fire ourselves. Controlled combustion organizing matter into life and consciousness. As you drift towards sleep, feeling the warmth and safety of your modern shelter, remember that you are part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first human who chose to reach toward flame rather than flee from it. The fire that warms you tonight, whether it's a furnace, a radiator, or an electric heater, is the descendant of that first controlled fire. The light by which you might be listening to these words comes from the same discovery that first pushed back the darkness for our ancestors.